Welcome to Back in Crime, a podcast presented by Texas Crime Travelers. I'm Stewart Fillmore, retired FBI agent.
And I'm Todd Hiles, retired Secret Service agent. In this podcast, we cover cases we worked and some we wish we had.
As lifelong street agents, we were where the rubber met the road.
While the big guys were doing press conferences, we were interviewing the criminals.
And because of that, we can take you inside these cases
and under the crime scene tape.
This is Back in Crime.
Today's crime is going to be interesting because it is a chapter from my childhood memories.
Wow, that could be a scary place.
Exactly.
I'm not sure I want to go there.
Well, a while back, I was in my hometown, and I went for a walk in my old neighborhood.
Okay.
And I came across this spot on a sidewalk, and I immediately had this flashback to something that happened probably 50 years ago at that exact spot on the sidewalk.
This is getting weird, man.
So about 50 years ago, I was walking along the sidewalk when this couple in a car, they pull up, like up next to me. The driver's side window was down, and they asked me for directions to a restaurant.
Okay.
I knew the restaurant that they were talking about, and I gave them directions.
Okay.
And
seems pretty innocent.
Right. But, you know, it's kind of this proud moment in my childhood that I helped out some lost adults.
Yeah, sure.
And I remember going home, and I immediately told my dad of this accomplishment. And his face, lost expression, and he tells me that I should never have done that, and that's not this good idea to talk to strangers.
Yeah. Okay. How old were you?
Had to be about 7, 8, something
okay.
like that.
Yeah, I can see that. I get his point.
And again, this incident should have just been forgotten, but I remember days following it. My grandmother gave me this big lecture on talking to strangers and saying that I was lucky that they didn't kidnap me.
Okay. So that kind of stuck in your mind?
Yes. But again, the word kidnap stuck in my mind because it was a huge word at that time.
Yeah.
And I was aware of a kidnapping story that was taking place around this time.
Uh-huh.
But we'll talk more about that story here in a second.
I'll just tell you something real quick from my childhood when you bring up the word kidnap. I think I remember maybe the very first time I ever heard that, it didn't register exactly what that was, but it's a strange word, kidnap. In the same way, same thing with the word brainwash. You know, when I think when I first heard that, I'm thinking, okay, how do you wash the brain?
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
So yeah, when you're that age, you have you're just trying to process the world as best you can.
Right. And again, the bottom line, I understood that kidnapping was serious, and that's probably why I had this memory in my mind of it. And I knew that there had to be something more to it, though, just the way that my father reacted about that, And
you could sense something. There was maybe something behind his warning.
Correct.
Beyond just, hey, be careful around strangers.
Right. And of course, at this time in your childhood, you're not reading newspapers. You're not watching the news on television.
No.
And any news that you really hear, it's from older kids in the neighborhood.
Yeah, right. Just, yes. Yeah.
And so around this exact time, I can remember the older kids were telling a story about this boy that was kidnapped, and that to get away, he hit the kidnappers with his skateboard.
Okay.
I guess at
That's
the time,
pretty resourceful, man. That's all you got.
Right.
You know?
But, again, at that time, that's just where that story ended.
That's like, seems like maybe an urban myth or something.
Right.
Looking back, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And again, this lecture from my grandmother, about kids, maybe that was just to scare me at that point, to stranger danger kind of a deal.
Well, 7 or 8 years old is still pretty young, pretty impressionable, even though, people of our generation, I remember spending all day going on the bicycle everywhere.
Exactly.
And going home sometime close to when it got dark.
Right. And your parents have no idea where you're
No
at.
idea. No
They
idea.
have no idea. And there's no way that they can get a hold of you.
No way.
Back
No
then.
cell phones, no nothing.
Right. So, again, after the other day, when I was walking there and I had that flashback, the investigator side of me kicked in, and I had to decide, was this really this kidnapping with the skateboard? Was that really urban legend, or was it something that really did happen? Again, something had to happen that my grandmother, my father had that reaction, right?
Okay.
But before we talk about kidnapping, because kidnapping and ransom kidnapping, that's not a new thing.
No.
And we know the 1930 gangsters that you love.
Yes. They branched into kidnapping.
Right. They switched from robbing banks.
Mainly were bank robbers, but they sidelined sometimes as kidnappers.
And we know here in Texas that there was a law that, average citizens got paid a bounty if they killed a bank robber.
That's right. We did a podcast about that.
Right. And so bank robbing was getting very dangerous and deadly for the bad guys. And then, in the history, I guess, of the FBI, we know when kidnapping took off with the Lindbergh baby.
Well, at the time, though, of the Lindbergh kidnapping was not a federal crime. It became one because of that case.
Yeah, that's right. They gave FBI jurisdiction in kidnapping.
That's right.
And I think people refer to it as the Lindbergh Law.
That's right.
And we did a podcast for our listeners that are unaware, but we did a ransom kidnapping on Frank Sinatra's son,
which I think is one of the coolest stories. It really is. It's a really fascinating thing. So if anybody missed that podcast, go back and check that one out about the kidnapping of Frank Jr.
So going back to Michigan now. So let's go back in crime, and we're going to travel. We're in the state of Michigan.
Yeah.
And it's November 10th, 1975.
Okay.
Now, before we go any further, I want to test your Michigan trivia, if you know a little Michigan history.
Oh, boy. Okay.
So other than what I'm going to talk about, this kidnapping, but also on that same date, November 10th, 1975, what happened in Michigan?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, November 10th is the birthday of the Marine Corps. So I don't know, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything to Michigan itself.
Well, I'll give you a clue. Are you ready?
Okay.
Your clue is Gordon Lightfoot.
Gordon Lightfoot. Oh, I know. It's the song. It's the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Exactly.
Yes.
So on that day, that
which
giant...
I've always liked that song, and I, for the longest time, thought it was about an old sailing ship.
Wooden ship.
Yeah, an old wooden sailing ship, from 200 years ago. And I realized it's relatively modern.
Yeah, it was a brand new giant freighter ship.
So that was on November 10th, 1975.
Yeah, and in the icy waters of Lake Superior, there's a violent fall storm that pops up, and all 29 crew members are lost in that sinking of that ship.
Yeah, as the song says.
So, well, let's go back to today's crime again. November 10th, 1975, okay. And again, this is a traumatic ordeal. We're going to talk about kidnapping and the intense investigation that ensued. Stewart, this is where you say buckle up.
Oh, okay. Buckle up.
All right. Two men, they have this idea of a quick money-making scheme. They're going to grab a rich kid, and their payout is going to be the ransom when it gets paid. These two guys, they're driving around in an affluent neighborhood, a high-income neighborhood near Detroit. And they don't have a target in mind or a victim or anything like that. They just want to find somebody that is easy to grab.
Okay.
Somebody that's
first
alone.
Priority.
Right. Somebody that's alone. They're not near a house. They don't want any witnesses. They drive around a neighborhood a couple of times. They see some potential victims, but they pass up on them because there were too many cars going by at that time.
So it's really more of a crime. They're just really a crime of opportunity. And what if your victim that is easy to grab, the family is in debt or just doesn't have any cash?
Exactly.
What are you going to do?
In fact, they see one of the victim, or they see a possible victim, but then they realize, that victim's too young. But in the same neighborhood, while they're driving around, is a 13-year-old boy named Timothy, and he's skateboarding.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And Timothy's...
maybe where the skateboard comes into play.
And Timothy's father is a high-ranking executive at General Motors.
So presumably then maybe the kidnappers might have lucked into finding the right victim because apparently there might be some money there.
Right, because the headquarters of General Motors is there in Detroit. And just a side note here, Timothy's dad is really a rising star in General Motors. And later he's going to become the chief executive officer of General Motors.
Okay, so there's money there.
Right, but these two men, they have no idea who Timothy's dad is. They just see that he's this soft target. He's easy because he's skateboarding by the road. So let me stop just for one quick second, Stewart.
Okay.
Does this sort of sound familiar?
Well, a lot
to my thing, the car was going to be pulling up, the kid's all alone walking the street.
Yeah.
And again, this happened the same year.
Exactly.
Probably
so
my story
it
happened.
kind of explains now your family's concern that you're talking to strangers that pull up to you in a car.
Right. So these strangers pull up to him and they ask him directions to Dr. Free's house. Timothy says he does not know that person, and Timothy starts walking away from the car. And one of the men gets out of the vehicle and he walks towards Timothy and he pulls a handgun from his waistband. And he orders Timothy back in the car.
Yeah.
And then this is where that urban legend becomes truthful, in that Timothy then hits the man with a skateboard. And the man actually drops the gun, but he's able to tackle and wrestle Timothy. He gets control of Timothy.
It's a pretty ballsy move, I got to admit, by a 13-year-old against an adult man pointing a gun at you.
Right.
That's a ballsy
to hit him
move.
with a skateboard, that he drops the gun, then wrestles with each other.
Yeah.
The man will actually hit Timothy twice in the head with the gun. But this guy eventually, he overpowers Timothy and he forces Timothy in the back seat of the car.
Okay.
And they blindfold him and he's driven to an apartment complex. Now, the apartment complex is going to be in Ann Arbor, Michigan, just a short distance away. But again, Timothy does not know. He's just known that they drive into an apartment complex.
Okay.
And when they get to this apartment complex, they transfer Timothy from the back seat to the trunk. And they lock him in the trunk of the car.
Oh, they don't bring him into the apartment then?
No. In fact, spoiler alert, Timothy is going to spend the next 50 hours inside the trunk.
And this is November in Michigan.
Right.
So the temperatures are probably cold.
Could have been pretty cold at this time.
I mean,
that he's in that trunk.
Yeah. Okay. Just on a planning basis, that doesn't seem very sound.
No.
Because anybody could walk by that car, and this kid is probably going to be banging on the car, yelling for help, and that's the kind of thing that tends to draw attention, and maybe someone might call the cops.
Well, in this case, they're going to threaten Timothy's life.
Okay.
And so they have
told him
him
to be quiet.
Right.
Yeah.
They told him to be quiet.
Okay.
And Timothy, he actually tells him who his dad is, and that his dad is at home, and that they can call him, and gives them, the phone number and everything. Like that.
Okay.
Right. So where we are right now is, again, we have these two guys that got very lucky, and they grabbed a kid or kidnapped a kid whose father has money.
Yeah.
Because the ransom can be paid, and they're going to get their payout.
Okay.
So after about 3 hours after the kidnapping, the kidnappers make the call, which would have been a Monday evening. They call Timothy's father, and they tell him, "We have your son." And they want $150,000 in small bills for his safe return.
Okay. 1975, $150,000 is a pretty good chunk of change.
And exactly. And they also instruct Timothy's father not to call the police.
Isn't that like standard kidnap?
That should be, yes.
Instructions?
Right. Exactly. Now, we're both retired federal agents. And again, this crime occurred on November 10th, which was a Monday. And so
I know where you're going with that.
Yeah. So the very next day is November 11th.
Yep. Veterans Day.
Which is a federal holiday.
Yep.
What businesses are closed on federal holidays?
Banks.
Exactly. So Timothy's...
In those days, they might have still called it Armistice Day. I think my grandmother, that's what she referred to it the rest of her life. At some point, they changed it to Veterans Day.
Okay.
But
the banks are closed?
Sure. But it's the same holiday.
Yeah. Exactly. And so Timothy's dad, he actually he reminds them of that fact, the kidnappers, or he actually informs them and says, "Listen, I can't get the money on Tuesday. We have to.
I don't
wait.
have this. I don't have this lying around the house.
Right.
I'm going to have to go to the bank. The bank is closed.
So
this is already presumably after hours on Monday.
Right. So we have to wait until Wednesday.
Yeah.
When the bank's open. So we're kind of now in this holding pattern for 24 hours.
And this poor kid is in this trunk of the car. That's what's kind of grabbing me.
Right. So, I guess if there's a lesson there, it's that if you're going to do a ransom kidnapping, don't do it on the eve of a federal holiday.
Yeah.
But
the kidnappers in the Frank Jr. thing ran into some similar Murphy's Law kind of things.
Yes. And my memory is correct, in November of 1971, D.B. Cooper hijacks the airplane on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. That's another eve
of a holiday,
right? But I in the end, I guess it didn't work out for D.B. Cooper either on that one.
Who knows, Todd? He might still be out there, dude.
That's true.
That is the case that brought you into federal service as a federal agent.
It's one of the earliest cases that I can remember. And again, shout out to our podcast.
Yes, there's another one
on D.B. Cooper.
It's funny how we do this thing out of interest and our own interest and our own fun because we like this stuff, and so if we're presenting this case in this podcast, but we keep referring to all these other things that we've talked about. You know why? Because this is what we would talk about with or without the podcast.
Oh, exactly. If we were in the car together, we'd be talking about.
That's right.
D.B. Cooper, on the eve before a holiday. And I think at that time we thought that maybe he was a genius because most FBI agents were already home or on vacation.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to Michigan here. And again, if you remember, the kidnappers tell Timothy's father not to call the police.
Sure.
And he doesn't. Instead, he calls General Motors Security.
Okay.
And General Motors Security
Which is probably retired Secret Service or FBI agents.
Right.
Yeah.
He calls them. They call the police, and they get the FBI involved.
Mm-hmm.
So now the FBI is involved. And again, we've talked about this before. The number one objective of the FBI really is the safe return of the victim.
Yes.
And they're going to do everything that they can to get Timothy reunited with his family.
Yep.
And again, you've worked kidnappings before, and the following minutes of a kidnapping, there's
crucial.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this one is sort of strange in that there's so much time now on the FBI side because Tuesday's a holiday.
Yeah.
And Timothy's father can't make that money drop. And I think I just mentioned that it was a holding pattern, but really the whole investigation really kind of slowed down to a crawl.
But I'll tell you, I can tell you a big reason why is, and what's scary about this is the randomness of it.
Right.
In other words, if this landed in my lap, the first thing I would be thinking is, who do you know? Who would know your circumstances? Who's out there that's targeting you? Well, okay, that's a fruitless pursuit, or path of investigation to go down because there is no one that's targeted you.
Right.
It's just a random thing by these people that have absolutely no connection to you. That's tough, very tough. So really all you have is a phone number, and again, this is the days before caller ID.
Right.
It's just that, the phone rings. You don't know where it's coming from. Now there would have been ways, I think, back in those days. This is a little before my time, of dealing with these matters and the technological limitations. But I think there would have been ways maybe that you could have gone to the phone company and traced that phone. Yeah.
Right.
But that's all you've really got, and it's to me that's what makes this a scary proposition.
Right. And at this time, again, it's things have slowed down. So now the law enforcement, they're coming up with several ideas how they're going to monitor this drop.
That's really all you can do at this point is focus your attention there.
Right. And one of the plans was that they were going to use a helicopter to watch the drop. Another one was that they were going to substitute an FBI agent in as Timothy's dad, and that there would be hopes then that he would confront the kidnappers at the drop. But all these plans are put on hold because the kidnappers, they're threatening to harm Timothy. In fact, on November 11th and 12th, those 2 days, Timothy's dad receives about 5 phone calls from the kidnappers. And that's where they're saying, hey, they're threatening, to do harm to Timothy if he doesn't bring this money.
And for a father, that has to be just terrifying, absolutely terrifying.
Oh, exactly.
And if I have the money, and again, that as far as the ransom goes, that is left up to the discretion of the family.
Right.
So if the family wants to pay that, then do it. As a father, I'm going to do it.
Right.
Because really they kind of have you over a barrel. I want my son back. I don't want him hurt. If you are dealing with me honestly, then I will pay you the money and I want him back.
Right. And I guess there's really no amount that you would pay to get your child back.
You would give all you
exactly.
could. No, there's no question about it. Yeah.
So on Wednesday, November 12th, he gets the last phone call, and he's instructed to take the money to a gas station and park near a payphone. So Timothy's father, he goes to that gas station. He's got this $150,000 in cash sitting next to him in the front seat. He's waiting by this payphone for over 4 hours, and nothing happens. And I'm sure the FBI has that gas station surrounded.
No doubt they have him under surveillance, and it's really almost like a game of chicken. Presumably, the kidnappers are doing their own counter surveillance to see if they can detect the presence of law enforcement at this drop site.
Right, and this is exactly what happens, because when Timothy's father finally leaves, he goes back home, and the minute he arrives at home, his phone rings again, and the kidnappers tell him, hey, we saw you there, but there were too many police near the gas station. So now you have to leave the house immediately and place the ransom money behind a building. And this building is a roller rink. And on November 12th, the night of this drop, it's just pouring down rain in this part of Michigan. And law enforcement has a difficult time trying to...
That really helps the kidnappers.
Right. They're having this difficult time, with a stakeout or surveilling the drop location, because now they're really afraid of alerting the kidnappers, because it sounds like they might have alerted them at the gas station. They don't want to do it at the roller rink. And just the way the weather is going on that night, it's almost impossible for law enforcement to watch the drop.
Well, you can't. You have, because you have visibility limitations, and so you've got to get closer, and then you have to weigh the risk of, if I get closer, then I'm going to be way more obvious.
Right, and this drop again was behind the roller rink, so they can't pass by on the road and see it. But at 8:24 p.m. that night, Timothy's father arrives at the roller rink, and he leaves the money. It's in a brown paper bag, and it has a red ribbon tied around it. And he returns home. Okay. He drops the money in the back. He returns home.
Yep.
About 3 hours later, his father gets a phone call, and this time it's Timothy.
And think for a moment, just on the in human terms of that. You've dropped the money off. You've lived up to your end of the bargain, and now just think how terrifying and gut wrenching those 3 hours would have been.
Had to be awful, just waiting
for that call, because at that point you have no control, and to me that's what would be very terrifying.
Right. But again, the father gets the phone call, and it's Timothy on the phone saying that he's been released.
Okay, great.
The FBI, law enforcement, they determined that the ransom money was picked up, because the bag is gone from back there, but they did not see who did it.
The best you can do in that circumstance is, in surveillance, is where it's too risky to get too close and to watch either a car, a person, a bag of money, you have to cover what are called the choke points, and that is, for instance, is there how many streets how can you get to this roller rink, and you would try to fan out as wide as you could and cover as many choke points as you can, not knowing again what you're really looking for.
Right.
So you're looking for something maybe suspicious, and maybe one thing that you could do is just get a description and license plates of every car that comes through there.
Right.
Okay, so that will give you a population of potential suspects.
Right.
That way. Other than that, I don't know how you do it. Other than you start tracing money, that's the way they did in the Lindbergh case.
Right. And again, this is 1975, and we know since then, law enforcement technology has gotten better with surveillance.
Sure.
There's cameras, there's drones.
Sure. Well, you could have put a tracker in that money too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the most important thing at that night was that the kidnappers.
In a way, Todd, I almost feel sorry for criminals because technology has made it way harder. Like this style of crime,
Right.
You almost never hear of this anymore, other than maybe cartels.
Right.
But that's done for a different purpose, really. But I can imagine how hard and difficult this would be to carry out now. Your chances of success. In fact, there are very few. I'm not sure in history how many successful kidnappings there are. Where the person, made the transfer, got the ransom money, and then lived happily ever after. I'm not sure if that's ever happened, but it's even exponentially harder today with all the technology.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, because now they would be tracking the phone calls and the phone.
Geofencing,
and
all these kind of things now. Yeah.
Exactly. So, again, I had mentioned that the most important thing this night was that the kidnappers, they're not alerted that the FBI is on the case. Because, again, they're able to pick up the money, and they got away.
Which, in some ways, that kind of is a good thing. Because now they maybe feel like they got away with it, and then maybe now they'll start spending this money. And presumably, this money, they recorded all the serial numbers of.
And they did.
Yeah.
They marked all the money. What also is unique about this kidnapping at the time is that the national, news media and local media in Detroit, they all agreed that it was going to be this news blackout.
Okay.
On this story,
because
the FBI feared that if this made it into the news, that harm might come to Timothy.
Yeah. So they're laying low on this story for a few days, I presume.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Again, that
helps. Like I said, it helps afterwards because maybe they'll let their guard down a little bit.
In fact, that Wednesday night, then that Timothy's released, the FBI agents interview him, and all he knows is that. He says, hey, these kidnappers pushed me out of the car with the instruction that I count to 100 and that I could remove my blindfold.
Okay. And
it's reported that Timothy only counts to 20. He removes the blindfold, and he runs to a nearby hospital. So, the kidnappers dropped him off near a hospital.
Good for him.
But at this point, even after the FBI interview Timothy, there's very, very few investigative leads because Timothy states, hey, the whole time, I was pretty much in the trunk of the car.
And I guess he couldn't give them a good description of the car for lead value there.
He gave a little bit when they kidnapped, so they kind of knew the color and the make of the car.
And nothing like, for instance, where one guy called Ted and the other one called Bill. There was nothing like that.
Nope.
There was nothing like in another case, again, not to plug another podcast. Again, this is just stuff that we talk about. But another podcast we had done about the kidnapping of the Urschel kidnapping, where they kept him on a farm, and he noticed that an
airplane went by
at certain times, and he was able to. That pattern then helped pinpoint where he was
being held.
Yeah. So again, they don't have anything like that in this case. So there's nothing that where really there's nothing to generate any leads. So all you can do is wait now for this money to start surfacing.
Right. In fact, he just heard two male voices. That he could hear that from the trunk of the car. So now on Thursday night, the next night, Timothy's mother actually goes on the national news and she thanks the media for keeping a lid on the story.
Yes. Okay.
And at this time, this Thursday, prior to that, the FBI, they really did this canvass of the neighborhood where the drop location was. Mm-hmm. And again, I'll let you kind of explain what a neighborhood canvass is.
Well, you just go knock on doors and ask people if they've seen anything.
Or anything unusual.
You would think that a grown man wrestling with a 13-year-old boy, especially after the boy has smacked him with a skateboard, you would think that might tend to draw attention.
Right.
So, yes, you have to go knock and try to find anybody that might, in that neighborhood, that area, that might have been there, might have seen something. Maybe they didn't
put two and two together.
Again,
people know their neighborhoods.
Yes.
And so maybe 10 minutes before this, they might have seen that car and said, that doesn't belong in the neighborhood.
Yeah, because these guys were just kind of prowling around.
Right. And again, there could have been a big break back then that a neighbor saw it and just wrote the license plate down. Said, that's weird. They don't belong here.
That's right.
And then they find out 4 days later that there was a kidnapping.
That's right.
But their canvas gets a big break when they go into a business, and it's a clothing store. Mm-hmm. And while they're in the clothing store, there's an employee that says, yes, yesterday we sold over $1,000 in clothing to 2 people. Mm-hmm. And they said that was just weird, that these guys came in and bought that much clothing in one day.
Yeah.
The FBI looks at the...
by 1975 terms, $1,000 of clothes is that's a lot of clothes.
Right. And so the FBI looks at the serial number of the money that was passed by these guys, and sure enough, it matches the ransom money.
Okay.
So
this is like in the movie Goodfellas, when they plan this robbery of the Lufthansa money at the JFK airport. It was called Idlewild in those days. But you see in the movie that they're kind of celebrating afterwards, and all these guys come in driving new cars. They've bought fur coats, and then Robert De Niro's kind of over this thing. He gets mad. What are you doing? You're going to get us all pinched or arrested,
Right, right.
And so then they start killing their own guys that could be potential witnesses. So that's and again, that's where you're going to get them, is they're going to start spending this money.
Right. And again, it was probably very odd to the clothing store employee to see these 2 guys come in and spend that kind of money. And I know we talk about the investigation business. This is what we call a big clue.
Yes.
This is a big clue. We've got the money.
Right.
And one of or an employee there actually knows one of the shoppers by name. Mm-hmm. And he says, this is who it was. And immediately the FBI locates this shopper and they question him. And he says that on Wednesday night, he was asked by a friend to drive the friend and another associate to the roller rink.
Okay.
So, and he identifies his friend as Daryl Wilson, but he says, hey, Daryl reached out to me. I borrowed my mom's car. I drove Daryl Wilson and his friend to the roller rink. But when they got back into the car, they had this package, and it had a red ribbon around it.
Okay. All right.
He says he doesn't think anything of it until they get to a house later that night, and they open up the package, and it's filled with money. And he says Daryl Wilson reaches into the stack of money and just hands it to the driver and says, this is for giving us a ride.
Yeah.
He's going to go on to say that he thought it was just found drug money because he tells the FBI he knows nothing of a kidnapping. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And the next day, the driver and his best friend, they go to this clothing store, and they spent the money that day.
So they paid him $1,000 at least.
At least.
Right? To go just be the driver, say, hey,
give me a ride to the roller rink. And I thought it was kind of funny that one of these guys that was spending the money at the clothing store, they're quoted in the newspaper at the time as saying, I was spending like a tycoon. It was free money.
See, here again, I'll just point out how it's a good thing that a lot of criminals are not that smart, because there's so many, they mess up in so many ways. okay, so I understand maybe that you're going to use this guy to take you there because it's a car that is not associated with you.
Right.
Okay, and I would tell the guy, hey, we have to go meet somebody, call it a drug deal, whatever. My car's broken down. Would you give me a ride over there? I'll give you $20 because I have to meet with this guy. I wouldn't show him that bag for all the tea in China.
Right.
I'd give him the $20 and I'd say, hey, thanks for the ride. Met the guy. It all worked out great.
Go about their business.
$20.
Right.
See you later. Thanks. But instead, you bring him in on this thing. You show him the money that's in the bag,
and then you give him $1,000.
Yes,
like he said, it's free money.
Yeah.
Now again, Darrell Wilson couldn't drive his car that night to pick up the money because Timothy's in the trunk of the car, right?
Oh, that as well. You're right. I forgot about that.
Right. So yeah.
Yes.
So again, this driver, or I would call it, the driver or the shopper, he identifies Darrell Wilson. Immediately, the FBI find where Darrell Wilson lives. He's 22 years old, and they set up a surveillance on him at his apartment complex. And while they're there, they locate the vehicle that Timothy sort of had described the kidnappers were driving. Eventually, the FBI spot Darrell Wilson coming out of the apartment complex, and he's taken into custody. And immediately, he admits to his involvement with the kidnapping.
Yep.
He names the accomplice as Clinton Williams, and Clinton Williams is 19 years old. That same night, the FBI finds Williams, and they recover about $137,000 in the ransom money.
Okay. It's pretty
and
good.
that was in Williams' apartment.
Yeah.
And Williams also confesses to his involvement.
Yeah.
So, again, this kidnapping, happens on that Monday afternoon, maybe late or early evening. The kidnapping happens. Tuesday's a federal holiday. Wednesday, some phone calls with the instructions for the money drop.
Yep.
Late Wednesday's the money drop. Late Wednesday night, Timothy's released. I think the papers said, like, on Thursday there were over 100 law enforcement people in the area searching for the kidnappers. And on Friday, these two guys are in custody.
Case solved. That's a great one,
Right. Now, the FBI plan to prosecute the case federally, but they turn it over to the state of Michigan because the prosecutors for the state of Michigan, they kind of believe that there's the punishment in state court would be a little bit more than what they would get in federal court.
And that's a normal thing when you have overlapping jurisdiction like that. If there's like bank robbery is an example, it's a state crime, but it's also a federal crime. Right. And sometimes just the individual circumstances of the case are going to be, the person is going to receive maybe a more harsh sentence on one side versus the other.
Right.
And so, that's a normal consideration.
And at this time, the two defense attorneys, they argue that they want to change a venue, meaning they don't want this case to be prosecuted in this township in Michigan. It's a suburb of Detroit. And again, they say this case has generated so much media following their arrest that they're not going to get a fair trial.
And that's not an unreasonable request either.
But again, to add a little bit to our to my Michigan trivia for you, Stewart.
Okay.
So they refer to at this time that there's also another giant news media event that took place in Michigan just months before Timothy's kidnapped.
Okay.
And again, in fact, it happened maybe like 3 months before Timothy was kidnapped. And again, it's in that same township.
Oh, I know.
It's that
searching my memory banks. I'm already ahead of you, man.
And it was a kidnapping.
Yes.
Same township.
Yep.
And this one happened on July 30th, 1975.
Yep.
And we know on that day,
I always forget the name of the restaurant. It's like
Fox,
Red Fox or something like that.
Yeah.
There's Fox and Macus. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Machus. And red in there, and I always forget the order of those three words.
Right. So we know on that day, Jimmy Hoffa called his wife from that restaurant in the same township. And he told her, hey, I'm here to meet 2 people, and they did not show up. And that's the last time.
It's the last we've heard of Jimmy Hoffa.
Jimmy Hoffa, that we know that he ever spoke or anybody's ever heard from Jimmy Hoffa that day.
And I guess technically that was a kidnapping, but certainly not like the one we're talking about, not a ransom kidnapping.
Right. But the defense attorneys, they bring this up, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. They bring up the news media about the kidnapping, and they're actually able to get a venue change. And so it's actually, the trial is now moved to a different part of the state of Michigan where potential jurors might not have heard about it.
Okay.
Now, when this trial starts, the courtroom is packed. Timothy's there. He's gonna take the stand. He identifies the kidnappers in the courtroom, and about this time, it becomes very.
So he saw their faces, I guess, right?
Yeah, from when they
first took him, especially the guy he fought with.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, just because
they had police sketch artists at that time. I wonder if that was considered to maybe try to get Timothy to, at least give a description so you have some idea, so that you have that Unabomber type sketch going.
Or ages of the people that had kidnapped you.
But it sounds like it was just a lot was happening in a very short amount of time anyway. Yeah.
But, and again, he identifies them in court to the juror that those are the 2 guys that kidnapped me. But the real explosive evidence happens when the prosecutor rolls the trunk of Darrell Wilson's car in the courtroom as evidence. Because during...
They cut the back half of the car off or something?
They roll the trunk in there because during the 50 hours that Timothy spent locked in the trunk, he's able to carve his name into the trunk.
Okay.
And not only his name, but he was able to carve Tim was here November 12th, 1975.
Very good thinking on his part.
That is some smart thinking.
Yeah. Actually, I've never actually been locked in the back of a trunk, so I don't know the amount of light that gets in there in the daytime.
Right.
So I presume maybe there was enough light to maybe he could get some idea what he was doing, or maybe he just did it completely in the dark and got a legible thing in there. But that's very, very impressive. Again, fighting with the skateboard, having the presence of mind then to write his name and the date in the trunk. It's pretty impressive.
So right after they roll this trunk in, both defendants say, "Stop the trial. We're pleading guilty."
Yeah.
In fact,
I'm amazed it went that far.
Yeah, when Wilson tells a judge that he's changing his plea, Wilson is quoted as saying, "There's not too much sense to go through it all. It would waste too many people's time.
Yep.
I didn't know all the evidence they had."
Okay, because the next piece of evidence I was going to put on was your confession.
Exactly. So, again, looking at this case, the real courage and the coolness was displayed by Timothy, right?
I know, it's really impressive.
I think he probably stayed calm, and that maybe saved his life.
Yeah.
If he would have fought more with them or tried to get away, who knows what these 2 guys would have been doing. We always talk about, man, how awesome would it be today if we could talk to Timothy? We'd have a bunch of questions for Timothy, and really want to know, love to ask him what went on in those 50 hours. Like, what more did he think about?
Yeah.
What did he,
I'm more, because I cannot stand being cold. I'm more, to me, the more heinous part of it is that he's in there being cold.
Right, exactly.
Oh my God.
But I mean, did they bring food out to him? Did he get a bathroom break? Something like that.
Yeah.
I tried to look through some files, and I just didn't see.
I would think you'd have to
anything.
limit that, because if it's out in an apartment parking lot,
people could see you putting them back in.
See you
and
go
taking
in there.
them
You
out.
just never know who's going to walk up. If you have that trunk open, and I'm surprised again that he didn't hear that Timothy, being a pretty smart guy, pretty ballsy guy, didn't hear, like, maybe a couple of females walk by that he could assess by their voices that they're not associated with this,
right? And then he could yell out
help on that car and screaming for help.
Right.
I'm surprised that didn't happen, but maybe they had threatened him seriously enough that he just decided, I'm just going to ride this out.
Right.
And my father can afford this. And
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm sure they might have shared it too. Hey, we talked to your dad. He's going to get the money. This will be over soon.
Yes.
Kind of a deal.
Yeah.
So again, to our listeners, thank you so much for listening. Hit that subscribe, follow button. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's a great story. It's great to hear successful stories because I was part of a kidnapping that was not successful. The victim was killed almost immediately by the kidnappers, and we spent a lot of time working it, but the victim was dead almost immediately. But so it's great to hear that this one worked out and everybody was safe.
Right. And again, it fills that childhood memory that I have.
Yeah.
Back then,
yeah.
that this did happen. Again, if you enjoyed this, share it with your friends.
Yes.
Join us next time on Back in Crime, where we will explore another investigation.
Yes, we will. Love doing it. It's a lot of fun. This has been the Back in Crime podcast presented by Texas Crime Travelers Todd Hiles and Stewart Fillmore. We are the executive producers. Grace Hiles is the producer and director. Theme music composed by Eddie Bandus. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and our YouTube channel at Texas Crime Travelers.